Hi, my name's Jen and I've been living with type 1 diabetes for nearly 30 years, which is a very long time, but I went through about half of that time pretty unawares of what my type 1 diabetes needed from me beyond the basics of testing my glucose levels through finger pricks and taking my insulin injections, which might sound quite wild to someone watching this in 2025 and beyond, when we have CGMs and we have Instagram and we have this wealth of diabetes information available to us from all kinds of different sources. But when I was diagnosed back in 1996, that just wasn't the case. So I went through quite a substantial, significant period of my type 1 diabetes life with very much the basics, and as I said, being pretty unawares of what I really needed to do to take care of my health in a more optimal way and help my time in range as much as possible. Time in range is something we all want, right? As people living with type 1 diabetes, we want to stay in range, we want to feel good, we want to feel like we're doing the thing and kind of able to go out there and live and feel good. But I'm sure you are aware, if you are listening or watching this, that time in range sometimes it's very elusive. It can be very tricky to get hold of and certainly tricky to keep hold of. So these are personal lived experience things that have helped me over the years to improve my time in range. This is just my personal experience. I'm absolutely not a medical professional. This isn't advice. This isn't education or instruction. It's absolutely just kind of how I've come to be and live with my type 1 diabetes. And I think for every person living with type 1 diabetes, there is a unique way to live with it. So just to be clear, you absolutely must speak to a medical professional before you make any changes to your diabetes management or healthcare. So way back when, probably about 18 years ago now, when I was finger pricking and doing kind of the basics, which is what I thought I needed to do, I was doing what I'd always done, which had been okay when I was a child and I was first diagnosed, but certainly did not fit the body that I'd grown into, the lifestyle that I'd developed. You know, we're talking about being at uni, coming out of uni, trying to figure out who you are and where you're at in the world. And it just wasn't a great time. I've talked about that on previous podcast episodes, so I will try and link some below if I think they might help fill you in a bit for context. As I said, I just didn't know what I didn't know. And I didn't know I needed to take greater responsibility for my health. I didn't know there was so much more that was in my control and actually my responsibility to do in regards to my health, and that investing and working with my type 1 diabetes was actually going to improve my quality of life rather than take away and distract me from the life or the type of life I believed I wanted to live. But actually the two kind of go hand in hand. But beyond all of that, what I absolutely didn't know was that I wasn't the only one feeling like this, and I wasn't completely alone. And I really did feel that in relation to my type 1 diabetes, that it was just me. And yeah, I just don't want anyone else to feel like that. So I want to chat through a few of the things that once I did get to know, they really did help improve my time in range. And that is to say that it's all relative, I understand that, but my glucose levels are infinitely better now on an ongoing and a day-to-day basis. And that has kind of compounded into creating quite a healthy, quote unquote healthy, you know, I still go out, enjoy myself, but for the most part, quite a balanced and what I perceive to be helpful lifestyle when it comes to the balance of living the life I want to live and taking care of my health. It definitely takes time and investment on my part, and that's ongoing. You know, the work is never done when it comes to type 1 diabetes, but it's definitely got easier. And as I've witnessed the outcomes I've had in my time in range, but also in other areas of my life, I would definitely say it's been worth it. I'm also on a hybrid closed loop insulin pump, which has made a world of difference when it comes to my time in range. So I think that's a significant factor. And if someone's on injections for their own personal reasons or it suits them, I don't want to undermine that. So I will say that on an average, it is achievable for me to reach around 80% time in range. Not every week and not all the time, And I certainly have days that are way, way below that, but I also have days that are above that. But I'm giving you that as a ballpark figure for where I'm at now. And as I said back then, I actually had no idea, but I know I used to run what I would consider to be out of range, because I think there were so many unknowns going through a day-to-day. The main thing I was trying to avoid was hypoglycemia, because that would interrupt my day. So with that, I think there was a lot of time that I was way, way, way above what I would consider to be in my personal range now. And, I would just do that finger prick at lunchtime with really no idea of what that glucose meter was about to say. You just wait for that 5-second countdown and hope for the best. And it could be anything from 4 to 14, and sometimes way above that. So that's kind of the ballpark where I'm at the moment. So things that helped me improve my time in range as a person living with type 1 diabetes. If you do end up finding this video useful or helpful or interesting in any way, please give it a thumbs up. Also, if you do like this video, I happen to have a type 1 diabetes podcast called Type 1-on-1, and I have very real, very down-to-earth chats with a whole host of guests, loads of people living with type 1 diabetes, but healthcare professionals as well. And it's all pretty informal, pretty chatty. You can put us in your pocket and hopefully it just feels like you're a part of the conversation. So the first thing is actually a precursor. I'm not counting it because I think as I speak to you in 2025, the benefits of CGM are so clear, and certainly the availability in the UK is such that it really is a no-brainer. A continuous glucose monitor, as opposed to the finger pricks I was on before that I have kind of referenced here. I would do a handful of finger pricks a day, some days more than others, and it would just be a number like plucked out of nowhere essentially. Because as many people know, listening to this, a CGM will tell you where your glucose level is at, but it also tells you where it's been, where it's heading, and how fast it's heading there. And I think having that information has been such a big piece of the puzzle for me in terms of being able to take action and make decisions based on that information to hopefully negate some of those spikes or drops and improve my time in range. But certainly if you're in the UK, you should be entitled to a CGM if you are living with type 1 diabetes through the NHS. That is my understanding. If that's not happening for you, then do some research, do some digging, speak to other people online, speak to healthcare professionals and find out what's going on there. The continuous glucose monitor that I personally use is the Dexcom G6. It forms a part of my hybrid closed loop insulin pump system, but my Dexcom G6 is very kindly gifted as a UK Dexcom Warrior. I've been using the G6 for many years now and I love the accuracy, the stability. For me, it works really well around exercise, and I really like the way the information is presented, as well as being able to customize certain things like my alarms and my alerts. So my official number one is carbohydrate counting. It's not sexy, but actually none of this is sexy. Type 1 diabetes just is not sexy. It's very boring, but it's something that I did not do for a very, very, very long time. And to this day, I still have not been on a carb counting course. 29 years into my life with type 1 diabetes, I kind of think I've missed the boat there. But when I realized how key this was, or that it even existed, I went and found a course online that's run by Bournemouth NHS Trust, I believe, and it was free at the time. I shall dig it out. It's called Bertie. It's an online version of the Daphne, as far as I'm aware. If I'm saying words to you that don't make any sense, Daphne is dose adjustment for normal eating, which is essentially a carb counting course. And again, I do believe that your healthcare professionals may be able to recommend you. And for me, understanding the grams of carbohydrates that I'm eating in relation to my insulin doses alongside the CGM data has been incredibly, incredibly key for me. And I went for so many years without knowing about carb counting. It wasn't a thing when I was diagnosed. And as I said, it just wasn't introduced at any point down the line. I don't know what happened, but here we are. Carbohydrate counting may sound really obvious to you if you're listening and you've been diagnosed in recent years. But yeah, I'm putting it out here because, sometimes we're guesstimating. Sometimes we're out and about and we can't weigh our food. But I think the more I've practiced with carbohydrate counting, the easier it has become to also guesstimate. And I've done a lot of traveling, and a huge part of that traveling was eating out and eating on the road and eating quickly and adapting to foods that were available and around me without, weighing scales or being able to measure properly or look at the back of food packets. So that's my personal experience. And just in terms of my practical experience, if I'm at home, I will weigh out my carbohydrates. If I'm out and about, I will work out the carbohydrate serving from the nutrition information on the back of the packet. And in terms of racking it all up, I use MyFitnessPal as an app to calculate my total carbohydrates for that meal or for that snack or whatever it is. Or to find out the carbohydrate content in the first place. If, for example, the nutrition information isn't available, I can select something from MyFitnessPal that might be similar. And as I said, I've got a pretty good gauge on like the size of things and portion sizes. And I definitely was woefully underestimating my carbohydrates before I came into carbohydrate counting. Number 2, in terms of increasing my time in range, was pre-bolusing. And I am pretty on it when it comes to pre-bolusing now. But again, something I didn't know about for many, many years. In fact, it was another member of the diabetes online community that mentioned it as the single biggest thing their consultant had told them that had helped them. And when I heard pre-bolus, that word, for the first time, I had no idea what it meant. I knew what a bolus meant by that point in terms of taking an insulin dose, taking an insulin injection alongside the food I was eating, but I had no idea what pre-bolus meant. So I do remember going away and Googling it. So I think I was about 24 when I first heard this word, and I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the age of 8. So if you think you don't know anything or you're behind, like, please let me reassure you that, you know, there is a lot to learn and it takes time, and I still don't know everything. Pre-bolus was one of those that just got mentioned in passing, but my goodness, it changed the game. So a pre-bolus, as I understand it, is taking your insulin dose a little ahead of when you are going to eat your food that you are taking that insulin dose for. And what's happening there is that you take the insulin, it's in your system, and it has a bit of a chance to start working, so that by the time you take your food in, your blood sugar doesn't spike, or my blood sugar doesn't spike quite as steeply or dramatically. And then I'm chasing that post-meal glucose spike less and less. When I was on injections and I realized how much pre-bolusing was improving my post-meal glucose spikes, I would inject in the queue of the sandwich shop to just give that Novo Rapid time to start working before I would then sit down and eat the sandwich. I just found little ways where I was taking my pre-bolus even if I wasn't in the ideal scenario. But again, that's all personal preference. I think the recommended standard pre-bolus time is around 15 minutes, but caveat, the timing of a pre-bolus is for you to speak to your care team about and get medical advice on. But for me, pre-bolus timings have been different with different insulins that I've used. So I needed a lot longer to pre-bolus for the insulin to kick in and start working on Novo Rapid than I do now on Fiasp, which is why I actually switched to Fiasp, because it gets to work a lot faster, which suits my lifestyle better. But again, in the spirit of sharing information, I didn't even know that there were different types of insulin that could work at different speeds, and that there might be one more suitable to my lifestyle than the one I was on. So yeah, that has also changed with my insulin pump and the different type of insulin pump I'm on. The pre-bolus timing has also changed there. So again, that's something for you to go and speak to your care team about. But for me, pre-bolus has been a really significant piece of avoiding those post-meal spikes as much as possible. Certainly, I don't necessarily stay in range, but when I pre-bolus, I absolutely have a better chance of not spiking so high after the meal and not having that afternoon, like chasing the highs, trying to get that high glucose level down. And you know what that roller coaster is like. It just doesn't feel great. Pre-bolusing can be tricky for me when I'm out and about, or if I'm at someone's house and I don't know when the food is quite going to be ready, and I don't want to ask because I think it seems rude to be like, when's the food coming? So that's something I sometimes have to work around, and I'm quite like aware in restaurants, like I'll look around the other tables and see how fast the food might be coming out, which does take me out of the present moment and can be annoying. But I think for me, again, it's just something I've got used to being aware of, and sometimes I will have a little bolus, if I don't know how big the meal is going to be, or I don't know what the carbohydrate content is, or I don't know how big the portion is, I will have a baseline minimum dose for around, say, 15 or 20 grams of carbohydrates and get that into my system so that something is working away. And then when the meal comes, I will try and calculate the dose that I need to take, the remaining dose, on top of what I've already taken. And for me, that has generally worked quite well. But I think for a lot of people, they might be understandably concerned about taking insulin and then crashing into a hypo. So again, it's for everyone to figure out their own unique way of handling this. But on the whole, certainly if I'm at home and I'm cooking my own food, pre-bolus is something I don't skip. Number 3, when it comes to things that have helped me improve my time in range, is trying not to overcorrect hypos. I was doing this for a long time, and again, I did not realize I was doing it. I didn't realize that I am actually pretty insulin resistant, and I don't need that much sugar to bring my blood sugars back into range in general. Obviously, it depends how much insulin I've got on board and whether I'm in the middle of exercise and things like that. But it's, again, something I've had to just work with my body to figure out. And for the most part, I actually don't need much, but it's so hard not to overcorrect a hypo, especially when you wake up, those horrible ones in the middle of the night where your body has had to work so hard to wake you up, or the alarms have been going off and you're already pretty hypo. It's dark, you're really discombobulated, disorientated, and you're sweating and shaking. This is my personal experience again, but if you know, you know. I think the recommended dose for a hypo is 15 grams of carbohydrate, fast-acting carbohydrate, and like none of that was a thing when I was a kid, like these grams, these amounts. So yeah, that was something that actually I didn't figure out until I got CGM data, because I could see the spikes so dramatically going up and pinging up out of range the other side and going hyper post hypo. So maybe this isn't something that everyone struggles with, but it's something I have had to learn, having lived with type 1 diabetes in a different era, shall we say. Another thing I've had to learn around correcting hypos is trusting that that sugar that I have ingested is going to kick in, it is going to work, and that I just have to give it a few minutes. And again, that is so hard when I'm sweating and shaking and I just don't want to feel in that horrible hypo state anymore, and just sitting in it for a minute and waiting to see that arrow turn on the CGM graph, and then I know I can kind of breathe and relax and know that the glucose level is on the up. But that is tricky. That is something I really do have to consciously practice, which isn't easy when your brain doesn't have enough oxygen because you are hypo. So yeah, if that's you as well, I'm with you. And if this all sounds like a lot, I would say that it's just intel I've kind of gathered over the years. Again, if you want to avoid the long route into gathering that information, absolutely speak to your healthcare team, your diabetes team, and they will probably be able to give you some very, very helpful tips in terms of correcting hypos. Number 4 on the list of things that have helped me personally improve my time in range is avoiding eating super close to bed. Now, caveat, definitely don't do this all the time. I loves me a good meal, I loves me a restaurant meal, and I love me a little snack, pre-bed snack as well. So it's definitely not something that always happens, but in general, on a day-to-day basis, when there is no special occasion, I will try and eat at least 2 to 3 hours before bed, and I will try and make that meal, unless, as I said, it's a special occasion, one that isn't super, super high carbohydrate and fat combined. And the reason for that is, as I understand it, fat delays the release of the glucose in that meal. So I can be very prone to a delayed spike in my glucose level. And if I've eaten very close to bed, that spike, that release of glucose, once the food has been a bit more digested, will be into the night when I'm fast asleep, and that can set me on a course for very annoying out of range overnight blood glucose levels, which I try and avoid as much as possible, because we are asleep 1/3 of our day, 1/3 of our lives, and with the help of hybrid closed loop now, it's actually viable for me to stay in range overnight, which makes up a huge percentage of my time in range. So if I'm just on a Monday to Friday routine basis, I will try and eat by around 7:30 p.m. So I know that I've got time to see how my glucose levels go after eating that meal before I want to go to sleep. And again, in the spirit of you don't know what you don't know, those high fat, high carb meals used to catch me out quite often. As a kid, we would always have a roast dinner on a Sunday, classic British household. And quite frequently I would drop into hypo after that dinner and then spike in the night once the kind of meal had been digested because of the high fat content of the meal and the high carb content of the meal. I think it was one of the biggest meals we would eat in the week. I would wake up with a high glucose level the next day. So now if I was in that scenario, I would do a split dose and have part of my insulin with the meal and part of the insulin 2 hours or so later. And if I'm awake, if I don't eat too close to bed, I can kind of oversee and manage that depending on how it's going and what my glucose levels are doing. I can manage the admin of that a lot better than if I needed to go to sleep. But again, that's something to discuss with your care team. And I love this one a lot more than just having time in range, because if I get a good night's sleep with no alarms and I am in range, it just sets me up so much better for the next day. In terms of how I feel and also in terms of my blood sugar stability, I think it's such a cruel irony that we need extra sleep and extra rest because our body goes through so much every day as people with chronic illnesses, but our sleep is so compromised because of that chronic illness. Just trying to get myself in range overnight as much as possible is really, really something that I've noticed has an absolutely massive improvement on my quality of life, which really has come into its own since I started on a hybrid closed loop insulin pump, because the insulin pump is making those adjustments overnight to help keep me in range. The last thing that I have experienced that has increased my time in range is a pretty personal one to me. I don't think everyone's going to like it, but thankfully I'm just speaking from my lived experience and this is what works for me. And that has been to reduce the parameter of my high glucose alert. So I brought it down so that the high glucose alert on my CGM goes off at a lower number. And that for me is information. So receiving that alert does not stress me out, but that's also to do with the way, well, it does stress me out sometimes. I should correct myself there, because nobody loves to receive a high glucose alert. I kind of eye roll the phone and I'm like, okay, here we go again. It doesn't stress me out in the sense that I view it as information, and it's also the way I've got my CGM set up. So mine is on vibrate and it vibrates to my watch first, and from there I can dismiss it so that I actually never hear an alarm unless I'm asleep and I haven't dismissed that first vibration on my watch. So sometimes, a lot of the time, I won't take any action because I know I need to let that spike ride out of its own accord. But what I feel it gives me is a heads up so that if I do need to take action, I can do so while my blood sugar is in the 9-10 millimoles per litre range, as opposed to getting that alarm when I'm 12, 13, knowing it's going to climb even more. It sort of gives me a heads up maybe to keep a bit more of an eye on it over the next half an hour or an hour. Again, I find that helpful. I think it's super, super helpful that I've been able to customize the way I get that alert and get that information. If the alarms were just getting louder and louder and repeating, then, you know, maybe that is something I wouldn't have adjusted quite so tightly. It also depends on what I've got coming up over the next few hours. If I get that high glucose alert after lunch, it's usually not surprising. That's generally what happens. It doesn't mean it's going to keep climbing, although sometimes it does, which is why I like to have that information. But if I know I've got an afternoon of work ahead and then I'm going to the gym, I'm probably not going to take action on that alarm. I'm just going to let it ride out. When I first got my CGM and I would ever see an arrow going up, the inclination was to take action and take a correction dose, and I learned pretty quickly that that isn't always necessary for me. But again, that comes with trying to understand as best as possible how my body reacts and responds to these different types of foods at different times of day. None of this is easy, and I certainly don't have it all figured out, but I think, you know, for me, trying to adapt these little tweaks as much as possible, and it doesn't always happen, and apply this information that I've gathered over the years, it has more or less made a positive impact on my health and my condition and my relationship with my condition as well. So again, it all just comes back to this is what works for me and this is what I've figured out. And I'm aware that the type of life I live gives me time autonomy. I'm freelance, I manage my own work hours, I don't have dependents, a lot of my time is my own, things like that allow me to invest a bit more time. But on the flip side of that, I've kind of built my life that way to enable me to do that. So it's kind of two sides of the same coin, if you like. But this is just all to say our individual circumstances vary wildly, and what's possible for me may not be possible for you. You may be doing things that I'm not doing. And again, it's just all us uniquely trying to find our way with what is a very complex, very challenging condition. So if no one's told you today, you are doing a great job. So those are the things I wanted to get into today. There are others, but I think particularly when it comes to something like exercise, whether it's strength training or cardio, that's actually a whole different episode in itself. So we'll leave that one today. But these are the things that I can think of that have made a pretty significant impact on increasing my personal time in range. If you have enjoyed this episode, I would love to hear your thoughts. You can catch me over on Instagram at Miss Jen Greaves, and I also have a podcast specific Instagram page, which is at Studio Type 1 on 1. That's at Studio Type 1, the number, on 1, the number, but I'll leave all the links in the episode description so you can just give that a little click and be taken straight to where you need to go. Please do come and say hi. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I will speak to you very soon.